Hi, everyone. Welcome to Northern Kentucky Forum's War for Future Talent presentation and discussion. It definitely feels like we're in a war for future talent right now if you've been hiring recently, so that's pretty aptly named. For those of you who are new to the Northern Kentucky Forum, the forum is a partnership with the 3 public library districts in Northern Kentucky, Boone, Kenton, Campbell County Public Libraries, and the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at NKU. And our purpose is to host civic discussions on public affairs in our community. So we're excited to bring this presentation to you today. We are also on social media. Please follow us on Facebook if you don't do so already, or visit our website, Northern Kentucky Forum, or NKY Forum, you don't have to spell it out there, nkyforum.org. And our event today is hybrid. So we do have people who are joining us via Zoom as well. So welcome to both our in-person and our Zoom audience. For those of you who are on Zoom, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or the question function. And we have a crew who's monitoring that and will kind of let people know as questions come through. And then, of course, if you're in the audience, just let us know when you've got questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's presentation, Janet Harrah. Janet is the Executive Director of Outreach and Senior Director for the Center for Economic Analysis and Development. Quite the title there, with quite a lot of experience and knowledge, skill, and expertise as well. So she is an accomplished researcher and executive with 20+ years of experience in regional economic analysis, serving a wide range of clients from Fortune 500 companies to state and local governments. And as the Center for Economic Analysis Development's Senior Director, she directs a team of research staff and NKU students conducting studies relevant to economic and community development, as well as elected officials and other policymakers. So please welcome Janet Harrah.
Thank you, Ellen. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? So today we're going to talk about a combination of economy and workforce development. So we're going to talk about, because people try to talk about them as separate subjects, but they're not, they go together. So the first thing you have to think about our economy today is we had the pre-pandemic economy, which kind of was finished in 2019. We had the 2 years of the pandemic, which was 2020 and 2021. And now we are coming out of the pandemic. So now we are in post-pandemic. I think to put the pandemic in perspective, the percentage of the population that died from COVID is equivalent to the percentage of the population that died from World War II in the 1940s. An event of that size is always going to have an impact on the economy. The other thing is that it continues to have an impact because an estimated 16.3 million Americans have long COVID, some form of long COVID. Those within the working age population, 18 to 64 years of age, that represents about 8% of our workforce. So that's going to be a long-term problem from COVID. We also have kind of 3 big disruptions right now. We continue to have supply chain disruptions. That's probably going to continue, particularly in the areas of energy and food. We have worker shortages. This is not a news flash to anybody. And then, of course, inflation. But when we look forward, we also see 3 areas where we see a lot of potential disruption for workforce in particular in the demographic sphere. Our population our rate of growth is slowing substantially. When we look at Northern Kentucky, the last 30 years, population grew by 40%. The latest projections show the population in Northern Kentucky growing the next 30 years by just 11%. So you're going from a 40% growth rate to an 11% growth rate. At the same time, our population is aging substantially. So we are shortly going to have 1 in 5 Northern Kentucky residents are going to be over the age of 65. So that's going to have a big impact on our workforce, the combination of slower population growth and an aging population. We are also having lots of changes on the geopolitical spectrum. Right now, pretty much everybody has lined up either behind the US coalition or the Russian coalition. You have a few large countries like India that are trying to play both sides. I don't know if that's going to be a long-term winning strategy. I think eventually they're going to have to pick a side. And anytime you have realignment on the political side, you're going to have economic realignment to go along with that. I think I know we're going to talk about it. It's going to be a bumpy road to get there. My husband saw my presentation and said, you need a moment of levity. So brownie points for the young people if they can identify the actress. It's Betty Davis, very good. But it is going to be a bumpy road because when you start having this many disruptions at the same time in the economy, you're not going to have a nice even growth, or even a recession is not going to be nice and even. We're going to have lots of ups and downs. And what we're going to talk about today a lot is we have lots of imbalances in our system. So some of the data is going to say it looks really good, and other data is going to say it looks really bad. And they're both right. It's because we have a lot of imbalances. Right now, GDP grew last quarter. We had the first and second quarter GDP went down. Third quarter it went up. We think that fourth quarter will be a modest growth, not great. We're getting very different forecasting of what people think is going to happen for Christmas sales. If you look at total volume of sales, it'll probably be up. If you adjust it for inflation, it'll probably be down. So any growth will probably be just because prices are up, not because people are buying more. We are expecting at least a mild recession in 2023. Some people, there's still an open question if we're going to get that hard or soft landing. And that's really going to depend a lot on what the Federal Reserve does. One of the questions is, how do you define a recession? There's been a lot in the media about how do you define a recession. These are the criteria that the National Bureau of Economic Analysis uses to define a recession. And note that GDP growth and inflation are not on that list. The two they really care about are income and jobs. And so the reason they haven't declared a recession, despite the fact that we had 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, is because jobs have continued to grow. And as long as you're having robust job growth, they're not going to declare a recession because that's one of their key metrics. Job growth year over year. This is why I never compare data for today to 21 or 20, because the data, those comparisons are meaningless. And here's where you can see it. If you look at year over year job growth, Cincinnati's jobs have been growing fairly robustly. But if you compare them to pre-pandemic levels, we've yet to recover the jobs we lost during the pandemic. So I haven't updated this. This was August numbers, but September numbers were now down about not quite 15,000 jobs. But we still haven't recovered from the pandemic, as it appears that we're going to start slowing the economy. One of the questions I've been asking people is, are we not creating jobs as fast as the rest of the country during the recovery? Or are we having a harder time filling vacant jobs in the rest of the country? I would say it's probably a combination of both, but I think this one is a real issue for us because of our population growth, or lack thereof. Our population just is not growing as fast. The other thing is, there's been where the jobs are being added and where the jobs are going down varies a lot by industry. So you can see that almost all of our job losses where we have yet to recover are still in that leisure and hospitality sector. Most of these are lower wage jobs. They're entry-level jobs. We're going to talk a little about the quit rate. People talk about how people are quitting. People aren't quitting necessarily. What they're doing is job switching. And they're going out of this industry and trying to get into some of the higher paying industries. And one of the industries that's benefiting up at the top is transportation and warehousing. You can go from making, at the start of the pandemic, you go from making $12 or $13 an hour as a waitress, going out to Amazon or one of the other warehouses and starting at 15. So we had a lot of job switching. It wasn't that people were quitting, they were just moving around. And again, we haven't recovered our jobs fully, but yet our unemployment rate is exactly the same as the rest of the country. You would think our unemployment rate would be higher if we aren't creating jobs as quickly. The real difference is not there, but it's in the size of our labor force. And once again, our labor force is not growing as fast as the rest of the country, so we're not keeping up there. There's been a lot of media hype over the last year and a half about people quitting their jobs, the quit rate. I don't like the way the media has framed that. They talk about record-setting numbers. That record-setting number, they've only been collecting this data since 2000, so it's for 20 years. So when we look at some of the older data sets they have, so for example, in 1945, they kept track of quit rates just for the manufacturing sector. And not surprisingly, after World War II, the quit rate was 6.1%. But again, it was a bit like today. The quit rate is high, but it's not because people are leaving the workforce, it's because they're job switching. In this case, we really did have people quitting. Women quit and men came in and filled up the jobs. Why does this quit rate matter? Is for the employer side. That churn is expensive for employers. But when we look at the actual quit rate numbers, the 2 years prior to the pandemic, nationally, we had 82.5 people quit their jobs voluntarily. The 2 years of the pandemic, 83.8 million. That means over 2 years, the quit rate was up 1.6%. Again, hardly a sea change, just a little slightly elevated. But again, when we look at the resignations by industry, you can again see where people are switching out of the accommodation and food into other segments. The other thing you can really notice if you look, take a deeper dive, if you look at the 3 orange bars, this is manufacturing overall. That's durable goods manufacturing, non-durable goods manufacturing, and durable goods. And the non-durable goods is not nearly as high as the durable goods. And that's because the pay rate for durable goods manufacturing on average is 15% higher than it is the non-durable goods. So again, you had a lot of people switching. If they could get a job in a durable goods manufacturing where you're likely to get a pay raise, people were moving. It wasn't that they were quitting the labor force, they were just moving. This is where the real change was. Of the people that left the labor market permanently during the pandemic, 70% of them were over the age of 55. People retired earlier than they would have otherwise because of the pandemic. It remains to be seen of whether some percentage of those people will come back now that the pandemic is starting to wane. But here you can see that the percentage change was up about 3.3% above trend during the pandemic. But some of this is also just simply demographic changes. Our population is getting older. And so retirements are going to be high, relatively high the next decade as the last of the baby boomers start to retire. This is the true great resignation that the media doesn't really talk about much. In 1989, roughly 4 out of 10 teenagers, 16 to 19 years of age, were in the workforce. That has plunged and is now well below. It is down to less than a third of teenagers that are working between the ages of 16 and 19. Now, one of the questions I have is why? We don't have good data on why teenagers are not working at the same rates they used to. So it's just strictly speculation on my part, but I think it's a changing attitude between primarily middle-class parents that they want their children to focus on school and other extracurricular activities rather than going to get that first job. Now, as a society, is not necessarily what we want teenagers to do, that's a different question. This is the real challenge for the labor going forward. So right now, millennials are kind of that mid-career. They're in their ages, they're the 30 to 40-year-old worker. When we look at the generations coming up behind them, there's 5.2 million fewer of them. So as the baby boomers are aging out, they're the largest group. Prior to the millennials, they were the largest group. They're now smaller because they've been retiring. But as the baby boomers exit, the group coming in behind them is substantially smaller. So again, we have these 3 overarching demographic trends that are going to change the workforce. We have slowing population growth, we have an aging population, but we also have increasing diversity in our population. So again, this is that over the last 30 years, our population is up 40%, and it's only projected to increase by 11% the next 30 years, which is a very significant change in population trends. It's hard for me to believe this because I'm one of those people, but in 9 years, 100% of baby boomers will be eligible for full retirement under Social Security. So at that point, you would expect that most of the baby boomers will have exited the labor market. And again, when you look at those growth rates, we are fast approaching the era where we have 1 in 5 residents in Northern Kentucky will be over the age of 65. This is another one. The numbers don't look as dramatic, but if you think about it, Currently, our population is basically 90% non-Hispanic white. Within a decade or two, we will be down to less than 80% of our population being non-Hispanic white. The only reason this trend is not more dramatic is because of the old folks. This is going to be an increasing trend. This trend will start to grow exponentially as the older folks pass away, because our younger population is much more diverse than our older population. One of the questions we have is, how do you maintain economic growth when your rate of population growth is slowing and aging at the same time? You know, employers have a couple of options. One is they could automate jobs away. So how many of us have been to Kroger with all the new lines that are all self-checkout? That's one of the realities, that's one of the ways they're responding, is they're automating jobs away. One of them is to try to increase immigration, which is a political hot potato that nobody really wants to address. I'm not going to address it either. So there's not a lot of good strategies. From a community, from our perspective, what we need to do as a community is two things. Number one, we need to try to retain as much of our talent as we can. Currently, students between the ages of 16 and 26, 25% of them are leaving the market, and they don't come back. So one of them is, can we increase our retentions from 75% and maybe get it a little up to 85 or 90%? The other thing is, how to become an area that attracts new talent. We know that job growth and population growth go together. This is the two together here. You can see they go together. When we look at the population projections and the growth rates that we're expecting, the population 20 to 64 years of age, over the next 30 years, on average, we're going to get 500 new people in that age group each year. I know this seems obvious, but all the new workforce entrants that we're going to get over the next 15 years, those people have been born. We're not making any more of them. Everybody's going to be competing over that same pool. That pool is not getting any bigger. And that 500 new workforce entrants a year, that assumes that everybody's going to work. Well, 100% of those people are not going to work. When we look at the 10 years prior to the pandemic, we added on an average of 39,000 jobs, or an average of 3,900 per year. So you have 500 new people entering that age group, the working age group, and we're going to try and grow 3,900 jobs and maintain our job growth. You can quickly see those numbers don't add up very well. At the same time, the median age is rising. I apologize, I don't know why we're getting these values instead of the numbers. So we're working off my memory, so I'm doing my best to remember. But again, our median age is going to rise, and our labor force participation rate last peaked in 1999 and has been going down steadily ever since. And unless there's something that will change that labor force participation rate, we expect on average that our new workforce entrances every year are going to be more than 250 people per year. And again, we've been adding 3,900 jobs per year, but the workforce is only going to be growing by about 250, 300 people a year because of the large decline at the back end of baby boomers retiring. The other thing we see here is a significant differences across demographic groups of who does and does not work by participation rates. I thought women still work, they participate at a much lower rate than men overall. The other thing is white women and Asian women participate at a much lower level than other demographic groups. The question is, what would it take to get some of these groups to work at a higher percentage? But then the other question is, do we want them to? There are societal reasons why you might not want that.
Could you about that again?
What's that now? This is the percentage of the people that are participating in the labor force.
Okay.
So white women are the group that's least likely to participate in the workforce, and Hispanic men are the most likely. Okay, and it's kind of a spectrum along the way. Now, this is not on the graph, but I can tell you, part of this is a correlation of income. The higher your income, the more likely you are to not have to work, because one spouse can support the family. I know there's this narrative that the government was paying people not to work. The data don't show that. I would say, if anything, the government is punishing people for going to work. There are many programs for the working poor, and for every dollar you earn in extra income, they want to take $1.50 away in benefits. So there is a window where it does not make economic sense for people to work more or to take a raise. That's bad public policy. That is not people being lazy. So I would like for us to, as a society, to address that. We should not punish people for wanting to work. But when we look at who left the labor force during the pandemic, this is kind of the three big things. Number one is we had early retirement. We mentioned that earlier. 70% of the people that left the workforce during the pandemic were over the age of 55. So they simply retired early. There was a lot of job switching. That is not the same as job quitting. And from the employer's perspective, it feels like it's an enormous amount of churn, and that's expensive for employers. The thing I keep telling employers is to think about this to put a positive spin on that. These young people, because it is mostly young people that were engaging in this job switching, they are gaining experience. In the long run, they will be better employers or employees for having more experiences at a wider range of jobs. They're gaining skills and experience. In the long run, that will make our workforce more skilled, but it's a painful process for employers, and we understand that. But the other big thing, we've talked about this, I think, as a community, but in our 3-county, Boone, Campbell, and Kenton, 1 in 4 child care workers have left the workforce. And so one of the reasons that women have dropped out of the labor force at a much higher rate than men during the pandemic is somebody's got to take care of the kids. And for most families, that primary job is still going to be the mom. So when we look at the labor market overall, we're not recovering as fast as the rest of the country. This is primarily due to a lower population growth rate. And we cannot maintain that historical job growth rates without increased labor force attraction and retention. So, who's ready for the fun topic of talking about inflation and the economy? If you're not depressed now, boy, wait. So, inflation is at a 40-year high. I don't think this is a newsflash to anyone. It's hard to believe, but prior to the start of the pandemic, economists in the Federal Reserve were worried about deflation. The inflation rates were so low that they were worried about how do we get people to spend more to increase the inflation rate. Now it's all about how are we going to get it back down. This is just to give you an idea. So when we look at the last 12 months and look at the percentage change in prices, so natural gas is up by over a third. Gasoline, all types, is up by 25%. You can go on down the list. The two that really matter the most to lower income households are food and energy. You have to eat, and you have to heat your home, and you have to have gasoline to go to work. Those are not choices that there's no substitutes for those. They have to purchase these. So when these prices rise, it squeezes out their ability to spend on other things. Yes, nominal wages have gone up. They've gone up by about 6%. But when you adjust them for inflation at 8%, the wages are not keeping up. And of course, if you want to tell it from the employer side, there's like, well, every time I raise wages, I've got to raise my prices to my consumers. So you're kind of getting the short end on both ends. You're getting it on your wages are not keeping up, but employers are having to pass those costs on, so the cost of goods that you're buying are also rising. One of the things that the government's not very good about explaining is the CPI does not capture all inflation. There are 3 types of inflation. There's the consumer price inflation, which is what we all talk about. That's the 8% that's right now. But monetary inflation and asset price inflation are very important to the economy, and they are also driving what the Federal Reserve is doing. So first of all is we've had a huge increase in the monetary supply. So basically we've been printing dollars. We did the same thing in 2008, and it didn't cause any inflation. So why the difference this time? In 2008, the money went largely to the banks, and the banks held it as cash reserves. The Federal Reserve said our banks were undercapitalized, so the banks got the cash and they kept it. So it never got out into the economy, so it didn't affect inflation. This time around, almost all the money went directly to consumers and businesses, and it got spent. And so you have too many dollars chasing too few goods, and hence we got inflation. When we look at asset price, I always tell people, think about this is inflation for upper middle income and high income households. Think about things like stocks, gold, silver, fine art, the stuff most of us don't have. Again, if you're flush with cash after the 2008 recession, lots of wealthy people were flush with cash. At a 0% interest rate, you're not going to put your money in the passbook savings account at the bank. You have to put your money somewhere to make it earn any kind of an interest. So the wealthy went and started buying assets, hard assets, which drove the prices up. Now we've had a bear market. Stock prices have pulled back about 20%. But how long that will last, we don't know. We've started to see a little bit of an upturn in the last inflation report with the expectation, and now that the midterms are over. So there has been a slight upturn in the stock market. We'll wait and see if it's going to hold. I do want to say real quickly, particularly given the news rate lately, cryptocurrencies are not the stock market. And cryptocurrencies really have nothing to do with the real economy. I know this is not a popular opinion, but cryptocurrencies is basically people gambling with their money. They're not buying a good or service. They're basically gambling. When we look at housing prices, the good news for us in Cincinnati is our housing prices were lower to start with, and they did not rise as fast as everyone else. So that's the good news for us in our market. But here's where the CPI tells a different story, because people look at the CPI number and it says housing's up 10.5%. And people try to go out and buy a house and prices are up 40%. So how can these two be telling me the same story? They're not. This one is telling you how much it costs to buy a house. Most people are not buying a house in any given year. The CPI is measuring the increase in price of housing for everyone. And most of us don't move. Most of us have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. We have a 1-year or 2-year lease. So we're not moving and our housing prices are not going up. The only thing that's going up for most of us in our mortgage payment are taxes and insurance. It's not the cost of the house itself. So I get a lot of questions about who caused inflation. This is an equal opportunity, folks. You can blame anybody you want, because the red line is the trend. The blue line is the actual inflation rate. So here's where we started the pandemic shutdowns. Inflation was at 2.3%. So in the Trump administration, we started with the CARES Act. And boy, we just kept on going, right through Trump and all the way through Biden. So if you're a Republican or a Democrat, pick the villain you want to blame. But we have the American Rescue Plan. We have the Russia invades Ukraine. Well, no, yeah, it's fun to blame that. It's a great talking point, but the fact is inflation was already almost 8% when Russia invaded Ukraine. So no, they did not cause inflation. They just exacerbated an already bad situation. So people ask me, well, should the government have been pumping all this money into the economy? Well, if you're a Monday morning quarterback, you say, well, that was terrible. Look at the inflation it's caused. But I always ask them, well, what would have happened to the economy if we hadn't? What would have happened to consumers if we had not helped people out? How many people would be homeless now compared if we hadn't helped people? So, I mean, there was not a no-cost way to maintain the economy if you're going to shut it down. We were going to pay a price one way or the other. I can't tell you anything about supply chain disruptions other than we're going to continue to have them. The two things that's really going to the pandemic is going to impact the supply chain from China because of their zero COVID policy and because the vaccines that China developed simply are not as good as the ones we developed. And because they have shut down their economy and they've shut down their population, and now you have things like Omicron, which are so contagious, their population has not developed any kind of natural immunity to COVID. So I think we will continue to see shutdowns from the pandemic, but primarily out of China. It's the geopolitics that are going to continue to really impact inflation and the supply chain, primarily in the area of food and energy. So what's our outlook look like? Well, we look at the headline numbers in 2022, they look pretty good. You know, jobs are growing, the inflation has started to, but when you look at the next level down, you look below the headline numbers, you see the weaknesses and warning signs. So here is the pandemic, and it looks like, well, we fully recovered. Well, not really. This is total GDP. But when you look at personal income, the only reason that personal income and GDP have recovered is because the two humps there, all that government stimulus money. Without that government stimulus money, personal income in Kentucky GDP would still be below pre-pandemic levels. Again, there's been a cost for pumping all that money into the system, but this is where you see the benefit of doing that. I only show you this graph. We don't have data on Cincinnati MSA GDP. We won't, it's always a year and a half in arrears before you get it. I only show you this because you can see that our GDP follows along with the US GDP, same magnitude, same direction, pretty much. That's been the historical pattern. Same with the unemployment rate. We kind of move with the rest of the country. Right now, the unemployment rate is running about that 3.5% to 4%, somewhere in that range. If the Federal Reserve gets its way by continuing to raise interest rates, their stated goal is to get, and they want the unemployment rate to rise. That is their goal. They're wanting the unemployment rate to rise to reduce demand. So if they get their way, we're likely to see unemployment rates in the 5% to 6% range next year. The other thing is when we look at initial claims for unemployment, currently they're kind of back to pre-pandemic levels, but we've got lots of big announcements and we know that those are going to rise. When we look at the forecast overall and ask what are our risks for the forecast, I still think it's COVID resurgence, but primarily in China. Inflation is going to continue to be a problem. I think what you're going to see, I think next year, it's very likely that headline core inflation that they talk about, inflation minus food and energy, will be at that 4.5% range. But I don't think you're going to see that kind of deceleration in prices for food and energy because of shortages. I keep reminding people, all the food that we're going to see in the grocery store the next 12 months, it's already been planted, it's already been harvested. And the harvest across the world was down this year, which means we're not going to have as much food this year as we normally do, which means with supply, that's going to reduce the supply, so prices will remain elevated for food. We have the same story for gasoline and other energy products. The demand has not gone down, the supply has, so I don't expect prices to come down. We're going to continue to see supply chain disruptions. Again, the two big ones, food and energy because of Russia and Ukraine war. Most of our nitrates, which is what we make fertilizer out of, come out of that region of the world. So it's inflation versus rising interest rates. And are we going to get a soft landing or a recession? So I went out and I asked their survey of all the big banks and their economists, and what are they forecasting? Well, they've got kind of a coin toss, but it's not really a 50-50. It kind of looks like that, but it's not really. Half of them are still optimistic they're going to get growth. I'm not sure what they're looking at, but I don't see that. 35% are expecting a recession, and about 15% are expecting stagflation, which is the economy continues to slow, that we start to get rising unemployment rates and job losses, but inflation doesn't really come down much. Thank you. Like I said, it's a nice upbeat presentation. Happy to take a question or two or a comment. Yes, sir.
You talk about inflation. How does cost of living fit into that? Because we've had, what, 3.5% per year for forever as cost of living. Okay, fine. Now we're talking 8% for inflation. Is that a component of it or not?
Yes. So one of the things that we don't talk about very much. So the Federal Reserve's target is to get inflation at 2%, which they will, one way or the other, will get there, and probably painfully, but we'll probably get there. What they don't talk about is that doesn't mean prices are going down. That means they just stop rising. And so for many people, their rent has doubled. You know, gas prices are up substantially. The price of a used car has gone up on average 44% since the start of the pandemic. So even if inflation comes down, the prices tend to be sticky. I mean, they're sticky downward. They won't come back down. So unless your wages are keeping up, your cost of living is going to rise relative to your income, even if inflation goes down. Yeah, absolutely.
So again, I'm asking though, that normal 3.5% per year for cost of living increase.
Oh, you're talking about for raises, yes.
Is included in the 8% or is above the 8% of inflation?
Okay, so those are two different measures.
Yes.
So how it works is as we get wage increases, that 3.5% you're talking about, employers pass that cost on in the form of higher prices. So yes, that 3.5% is reflected in the higher prices at that 8%. Yeah.
Why don't we just say the cost of living's gone up 8% and forget it?
Because I'm not giving the raises out. Not my choice.
It amounts to the same thing as what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah. And then if you're the employer, you have to kind of balance that. I want to maintain my workforce, so I need to give them a raise to keep them. But every raise I get them means I've got to raise my prices, which consumers may or may not be willing to buy at a higher price. So they're balancing that out to how to maintain their profits.
But the way they're doing it now is where I could buy a whole loaf of bread for $3.50 instead of the normal $2.29 I was paying, or I can buy half a loaf at $2.
Yep, that's about it works, yeah. Thank you very much, appreciate it. Oh, I'm sorry, Mark, go ahead.
You addressed this a little bit, but if you talk a little more specifically, is there a forecast on how long a recession, I think you used hard and soft, forecast on how long a recession might last if we have that in 2023, and what is typical for the length of a recession?
There is no typical length of recession. And when we talk about a hard or soft landing, what that means is, first of all, that both of that assumes that there's going to be a recession. And then hard or soft is how deep are the cuts in the number of jobs and how high does the unemployment rate rise. So you would say that 2008, that is definitely not a soft landing. That was a hard landing recession. We had enormous job losses, very high unemployment rates, and it lasted for a couple of years. That would be the kind of the hard landing scenario. A soft landing scenario would be more like what we saw after 9/11. We had a big recession, it lasted less than 12 months. It was painful for those 12 months, but we recovered very quickly. So that's what the difference between a hard and a soft. Right now, again, we have dueling policy. The Federal Reserve is doing everything it can to slow down the economy, as the federal government is doing everything it can to get consumers to spend money. And so these two policies are not in sync. They're working against each other. Yes?
I've seen great information as always, and I know I've seen different things about the workforce and labor participation and demographic drought and stuff, but the point that you made about the high school age students, I don't know if I've seen that before, and I think that's very important as we're thinking about how do we get some more of these workers. And my oldest is almost 11, so not quite in that age, but I definitely see, as you kind of anecdotally said, the more pressure in terms of wanting to do, sports is much different than when I was younger. You start earlier and it's more intense, and so I think that's going to continue to be an issue, but that's an important point. I think that we haven't talked about as much in terms of how do we attract certain people to come into the workforce. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yep. And I think most employers would say they would love that kid that's worked for 2 or 3 years as a waiter or stocking groceries or whatever that might be, to get that real world experience. But for whatever reason, middle class parents have said, no, we don't want our kids to do that anymore.
One really, and I'm taking a risk here, making out of the building alive. You mentioned the population changes. The United States, I suspect you're saying, is growing at 11%.
Those were Northern Kentucky numbers.
Northern Kentucky numbers, okay. As far as the country is concerned, is there a percentage there?
Okay, so those trends are the same nationally. I don't know off the top of my head what the exact percentages are, but the U.S. population growth is slowing. The population is getting older. That's true across the country.
Right.
We're kind of in the middle of the pack when it comes to developed countries. Kind of the poster child for what happens if you have slow population growth coupled with aging population is Japan, which has basically had no economic growth for decades. Right behind them is China. China's population is actually going to start to decline over the next 25 years because of their one-child policy. Again, those kids are already born, so their workforce is going to start to decline simply because of demographics. Right behind them is most of Europe. There's a few exceptions in Europe, but primarily Europe is in the same boat. We probably won't be as bad as the rest of the developed world because we still allow immigration.
Along with that, though, if I heard it correctly earlier this week, the world population has now gone up to 8 billion, which means that there are people out there with the policies of this country around immigration, and this is where I take the risk, abortion. The notion of the government is if we stop abortion, the population of the United States will grow, assuming, and that will be in-house growth of our country, where those will be culturally United States people, as opposed to the immigrants that have to be nationalized to become citizens or whatever that process is. My suspicion is if the government, which tends to be involved with personal choice, if they had explained differently that the population of our country is dropping, the overall population is dropping, not just based on groups or ethnicities. The whole country's population is dropping. And, again, risky word, the notion of having the breeding activity among women, which they didn't volunteer for, and how if we're going to increase the population of this country, then immigration seems to be a way to do it, if we could change our policies to know how to do that better.
Well, I think, I'm not going to speak to the abortion. I'm an economist. That's not really my area of expertise, so I'll leave that to somebody else. I'll leave that to the sociologists at NKY to talk about that. But on the immigration policy, I think any economist will tell you, on net, immigration is good for economic growth. If we want to maintain the rate of economic growth we've had over the last few decades going forward, we need to have immigration. I think most economists would also tell you we need to reform and have a much more robust legal immigration system that allows more people to come here legally in a much quicker manner and to become citizens and the ability to write and the right to work much more quickly. Those are all federal policy choices. Those are not things that we can have a much impact on locally other than to advocate to our DC delegation that that is policy that's good for the economy.
But you just said the magic word. It's an economic issue, not just a social issue alone.
It is interesting, though, what you just described. I'm 56. It's been that way my entire life, as far as the challenges with legal immigration. They have no intention of fixing this, because if they did, they would have done it 40 years ago. So I don't get it. I really don't, because we clearly need more workers. I mean, just everybody who's going to join the workforce in the next 15 years are already born, and we don't have enough now. We're not going to have more. So that's really, between automation and immigration, those are our two answers. But immigration's a big piece of that pie, and if we can't legally immigrate people, it's not good enough to bring people in that, and they can't function. You know, you have to bring them in. And so how do we fix it?
Again, that is a good question that I do not have a good answer for.
Isn't it a frustration that, like, literally our entire lives we've heard the same story over and over about legal immigration, and it just never gets done, ever. They don't even talk about it, really.
Yeah, so when we talk, so here's a real world example for Cincinnati specifically. So The best importer of talent in the region in terms of numerical numbers is University of Cincinnati. They bring in thousands of students from around the world every year, but we can't retain them because we don't have enough H-1B visas so they can all stay and work.
So this is insane. Right now, I have a young woman working for me. She's from the Ukraine. Her husband's an attorney. So he's at Georgetown Law, so he can practice in the U.S. I can't pay her. I'm not allowed to pay her. But she's working for me full time. And that to me is insanity because I want to pay. I don't even feel right about it. But I needed her. And so these are the kind of policies that just are mind-blowing.
So what you're getting, I mean, part of the reason I would speculate that they don't want to really truly address the southern border. Those are, by and large, the people that are coming across the southern border, that first generation that comes across the southern border, they are taking jobs that Americans do not want, okay? When you're talking about the H-1B visas, if we bring in those immigrants, they are going to compete for jobs that you want your kid to have. Because by and large, the people that are coming through the H-1B visas, they are highly educated, have lots of skills, and they're going to compete with your kids for good paying jobs. And that's why we have two different systems of immigration. And they're both broken, but they're broken for reasons that, from a political standpoint, there's a lot of politicians that just as soon leave it alone. Good, bad, or otherwise. Yeah. Well, I know we're supposed to adjourn at 10, and I know that they probably have closing remarks. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.